a little bit about the hand-marked paper ballot pilot. We learned some things. We, have not ourselves ever conducted one, so, most of these folks saw me in front of the legislature telling them it would be really difficult, and there were these issues. And there are some things that were difficult about it, but there were also some things that I think were a little surprised at and pleased about. When there was an issue with the poll pad encoding cards, which has been in the news and several folks have already mentioned it, and technicians had to reprogram the encoding part of the poll pad, so it was able then to encode a ballot card. We didn't have a problem because our ballots were already printed. So that was a relief on our part, whereas the other pilot counties were really scrambling to get their poll pads reprogrammed and able to encode cards. We just continued with the processes that we were already starting with, which is handing out the paper ballots. I'm aware of only one case, and there may be more, but this was one that was made made aware of, where a couple came in and the wife was visually impaired and wanted to use the ballot marking device, and we were not able to encode her card at that time. So we did issue her a paper ballot, and her husband was there to assist her, which, she was able to vote, and an assisted ballot is fine, except that we would rather that she had the independence to use the audio ballot. We had, there were a couple other things that I was going to talk about. As far as we had a late delivery of the uninterruptible power supplies, which were the units that the vendor was providing to all the counties in case the printers failed. If there was a power outage and we didn't have power, we couldn't print any ballots. So the vendor was supplying a UPS unit for every 2 ballot marking devices. Well, getting those was coming in at the last minute. We were delivering them to the polls on Monday before the election. But really that didn't concern us as much as it did other counties, because if we can't print a ballot, we still have ballots already printed. So again, there were some pros and cons. Some of the things that were difficult about it was getting all the ballots to the polling places. Because with the handling of live ballots, as folks have mentioned, the chain of custody is very important. And the Georgia Code does say that you have to have a ballot printed for every active registered voter. And in these 16 precincts, there were 72,000 somewhat registered voters. So we had to print enough ballots to account for absentee mail and early voting and the polls. And we took that 73,000 and we split it across those different types, because we knew we had way more ballots than we even needed. And then what ended up happening is we looked at a case that we already had, because we didn't want to buy anything, that was on wheels that we could provide to the poll workers with their pre-printed ballots, and they could wheel it to the poll. Well, it was too heavy to lift with the number of ballots that would have been allocated to the polls. So we rethought that, and we decided we would send them, cases that we already had, but they were smaller cases that we would put 600 ballots in each case, and we gave them 3 cases at the biggest polls. And then that still wasn't all the ballots that we were supposed to provide to every registered voter, so we kept some behind, and we got a plan in place that if they ran out after they would get to a certain point in their supply, they would contact us and we would get those back out, and we had a chain of custody form ready to transport those. So we kind of had some planning, rethinking, because it was just logistically too many ballots to send out with poll workers to have them lift the cases. But it worked out fine. They didn't need any secondary transport of any ballots. Every poll had enough ballots in the first allocation that we gave them. And then just to talk about a little bit how many were cast on each of the two different types. We were concerned at one point when we were planning that, you know, people might choose to vote on the BMD when we were basically set up.
Did you explain that BMD?
BMD, ballot marking device,
Okay.
yeah, so, thank you. We were basically planning our numbers of ballots and supplies with the thought that the ballot marking device would be only for those who had disabilities and needed, you know, visual enhancements or audio ballots. So we put most of our resources into the hand-marked ballot. But we were concerned that what if more people wanted to use the ballot marking device and there was a line, because we only had one at each of the polling places. As it turned out, that didn't happen at all. We had a total of 41 ballots that were cast on the ballot marking device between the election day polls and the advanced voting locations. So it truly ended up being just for those who had, you know, some kind of a disability that they couldn't mark a hand-marked ballot.
What was the number again?
41.
41, okay.
Mm-hmm. And then 11,599 were on the hand-marked paper ballots. So it truly was a real pilot of that system, and the ballot marking device was there just as a fail-safe for disabled voters. And of those 11,599 that marked a hand-marked paper ballot, we had 55 that required spoiling. And that was a lot smaller number than what I expected. In some of the discussions about this process before we actually embarked on it, there was a lot of talk about hand-marked ballots were marked improperly a lot of times and they wouldn't scan. What we found happened is, yes, people did mark them irregularly with a check mark or an X or in some other way, but when the scanner rejected that, as I don't understand this is an irregular mark, voters were able to correct that in a lot of times and just completely fill out the bubble, even if the little tail of the check mark was still outside the lines, and it was able to read the filled in bubble just fine. So there was some correction. I've taken to heart some of what people have talked about as far as privacy. We'll kind of talk about that a little bit more. We do want to assist voters that are having a ballot come back out so that they know how to fix it or how to interpret the message that comes out. But we do want the voter to have a private ballot. And a couple of people have talked about the issue where the ballot, we had actually put on our scanner, we put a sticker on there that, was just something we came up with, and I don't know if anybody else did, but we said insert face down. Because we did recognize that if there was an assisting or there was some education of the voters that needed to take place, that we didn't want the ballot to be out there. So we were, in most cases, voters read that and put it face down. But we did experience a couple of scanners that after a period of time, they were not reading it quickly face down. It had to be inserted and reinserted several times before it would read it. And it does read 4 different ways. It reads it, top, face down, face up, and then bottom first, face up and face down. So they were trying a secondary way to see if it would go through that way, and they flipped it face up, and it was reading it when they did that. So we're going to talk more with the vendors and with the state about some of those issues. Again, as I said, this is a pilot, so we're going to take back all the good and the bad. And we're supposed to be meeting with the vendors in the state on Friday to go over some of what went right, what went wrong, and hopefully improve the process for March coming up. Well, we're going to do it again in December, so.